Number 10. Truck Stop Killer. Ben Rhodes, also known as the Truck Stop Killer, was a truck driver who had reportedly admitted to torturing women for 15 years straight while driving throughout America. Alligator clips, chains, shackles, whips, and sex toys were stored in the sadistic trucker's suitcase. When an Arizona state trooper spotted a tractor-trailer pulled over on the side of the highway, he approached to have a chat with the man. Rhodes had parked his large truck dangerously close to the shoulder of Interstate 40. What unfolded next was totally unexpected. The trooper discovered a naked lady with a gag in her mouth, chained to the door, covered in wounds, and wearing a horse halter around her lips and neck, inside of Rhodes's cab. Rhodes tried to say that it was a private, consensual matter, but of course, the trooper didn't buy it and arrested him. He also discovered a pistol in the truck. At the time, Rhodes faced only kidnapping and assault charges, but as authorities would soon learn, Robert Rhodes was actually one of the most dangerous sex offenders and serial killers in American history. Rhodes is now 74 and is currently serving his 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole at the Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois. Number 9. Anonymous Survivor. This is the story of a young man who was pursuing a career in medicine at the University of Chicago. After a morning class one day, instead of paying for a taxi, he chose to hitchhike back home to Lincoln Park on the north side after a morning lecture. He obviously had no idea what would happen next. A man in a Plymouth Satellite offered him a ride. The man appeared normal and nice to the boy, so he got into the car and they headed towards Lakeshore Drive. However, after they arrived, the man drove south instead of north on Lakeshore towards Lincoln Park. The youngster urged the man to turn around because he was going in the wrong direction. The man simply looked towards the boy, placed his hand on his knee, and said, "No, son. You are coming with me," with a really dark grin. When they encountered traffic on the South Shore, the boy froze in fear and hurriedly opened the passenger door and bolted out without looking back. The boy was drinking coffee in a cafe a year or two later on a frigid December day when he saw something on TV that scared the living daylights out of him. He recognized the same man who had picked him up from the school previously. John Wayne Gacy was arrested for the alleged rape and murder of more than 20 young men and boys. He'd also removed the passenger side door handle to prevent the men he'd picked up from fleeing. The boy had totally dodged a bullet, and just in time. Number 8. Act of kindness turns into tragedy. An act of generosity swiftly turned into a tragedy in the year 2015 when an 18-year-old Oklahoma lady was shot dead by a hitchhiker she picked up on the roadside. According to the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigations, Kaylee Massey and another man were traveling at night through Oklahoma City to Canton, roughly 90 miles or just under 150 kilometers across the state, when they allegedly picked up a man seeking a ride. The man who got a ride with the two in Oklahoma City then fatally shot Massey approximately 2 miles or just over 3 kilometers east of Canton before escaping from the crime scene. The driver hurried to the Canton Police Department to get assistance for Massey, but it was too late since she was already dead by that time. The reasoning behind the shooting was not immediately known. Christopher Blake Scruggs, 23, had been identified as a person of interest in the crime, and he was also wanted for questioning in connection with another violent incident in Logan County at the time. Who would have thought that something like this could happen to Massey simply because she agreed to offer a ride? The news came as a shock to many who knew her. It's crazy how an act of kindness quickly backfired in the most unkind and catastrophic way. Number 7. Trash Bag Killer. After haunting California's roads in the 1970s, Patrick Kearney earned the title Freeway Killer. He would pick up male hitchhikers or men in gay bars. After convincing them to go with him, he tortured and sexually assaulted them before he murdered them. Sometimes he would even engage in acts of necrophilia with his victims. After he was done carrying out these vicious and disgusting crimes, he would usually dismember the bodies and dispose of them in industrial trash bags along the highways. This is how he became known as the Trash Bag Killer. Kearney is accused of murdering up to 43 men, though he only pled guilty to killing 21 people. He confessed, hoping in return prosecutors would drop the death penalty. Kearney claimed he only did what he did as a way of venting his fury because he was bullied as a child. He was handed 21 life sentences in March of 1978. Number 6. The Runaway. In November 1958, Thomas Prendergast from El Cajon, California, picked up a runaway hitchhiking on the side of the road. It was Carl Alfred Eder, a 16-year-old from New York. Prendergast felt sorry for the homeless kid, and out of the kindness of his heart, he decided to let Eder stay with him and his family until he got back on his feet. Prendergast had no idea that he was being kind to a kid that would eventually murder his entire family. Prendergast left for work one day on December 12th. When he got home, Eder was standing outside the house and asked him for a ride to the bus station so he could travel to San Diego. Prendergast complied and left Eder at the station. Prendergast then went back home only to make a horrifying discovery. His wife Lois had been shot to death. The couple's 4 children, all under the ages of 10, had been stabbed and murdered with a hunting knife. Police arrested Eder 2 days later. Eder claimed that he had snapped and thrown one of the kids to the floor because they were being too loud. As Mrs. Prendergast tended to her injured daughter, Eder shot her. He then proceeded to murder the family members that were in the house. When the 2 sons returned home from school, Eder killed them too. He was given 2 life sentences, but in October 1974, Eder managed to escape from prison and has never been recaptured. He left behind a note which read, "I've done enough time and I'm leaving." It became known that before Eder became a runaway, he was seen hanging out with motorcycle gangs and radical left-wing anti-government groups. It's speculated that one of these groups might have found him before the police did and murdered him. If he is still alive, Carl Alfred Eder would be 73 years old today, and there is still a $20,000 reward for his capture. Number 5. Strange noises. A woman was driving late one night around 2 a.m. on I-80 when her car began to make an unusual grinding noise. It seemed as though she had run over something and it was stuck underneath her car. She pulled into a rest area and woke up her friend that was with her. As they stepped out of the car, she described it to him, but instead of the grinding noise, they both heard what sounded like a child sobbing. They had heard reports of child trafficking and kidnapping in the area, and although there were no other vehicles at the rest stop, they decided to search the area for the source of the noise. They took their flashlights and walked over to the women's restrooms, where the noise was coming from. They were expecting the worst, but didn't find anything. The sound was somehow still audible and clearly originating from the room. They switched on the lights, but nothing was visible. Her friend climbed one of the stalls to reach the top window of the restroom, which was open. When he shut it, the noise abruptly stopped. After opening it again, there was still no noise. The window then slammed shut by itself without the man touching it. They ran out of the restroom in a matter of seconds. After about 10 seconds, the noise kicked up again. Frightened now, they hightailed it out of there. They stopped a few miles down at a truck stop. They looked under the car and discovered a red and silver metal object jammed between the car and the road, the source of the noise. They were unable to remove it by hand, so they bent it slightly and drove home. A week later, the woman had it removed by her mechanic and discovered it was part of a child's tricycle. On the rear, there was a red space where someone could stand and ride. Can you connect the dots? That was a really creepy highway drive. Number 4, a long haul. A man used to drive through Texas a lot for work, but there was only one route he always avoided. It's in the center of historic Native American territory. The man claimed that when he had driven through the area before, he kept seeing shadows racing beside his trailer, and he would occasionally hear a loud boom as if someone was hitting the trailer's side. He decided to pull over and check for a blown tire, as he figured perhaps this was the noise he kept hearing. He walked around the truck and did an inspection, and as he rounded the corner, he heard a chuckle and a shadow bolted down the road. Needless to say, he was scared out of his wits. So he immediately hopped into the truck and kept driving his way until daylight. About 15 miles or just under 25 kilometers later, he claims to have seen the skinwalker standing on the roadside with its arms folded. No wonder he chose to avoid the route ever since the incident. Number 3, Blue Car. In 2001, 2 girls, just 17 years old, were driving back from a late-night movie. They were traveling through the woods when they came upon a median with a car parked in it, facing the oncoming direction, and all of its lights turned off. The car flashed its lights, made a 3-point turn, and began following them as soon as they drove past it. They didn't think much of it and even made a joke saying, "Oh, that must be a gang initiation. We're going to get murdered." They really didn't think anything was going to happen. The road's turnoff was a few miles ahead, and the vehicle followed them the entire way. The vehicle continued down the highway after they made the left turn, and they were a little relieved since it wasn't following them anymore. However, just 30 seconds later, they realized that the vehicle must have backed up on the highway and followed them to the turn. Once they realized this, they started to panic. Before they could get to their house, they had to turn down one more road, and the car did the same thing as they thought it would, backing up and taking the left behind them. Now they were extremely terrified. The vehicle followed them right into their driveway and almost up to their house. They rushed inside just in time to see the mysterious car reverse down the driveway and zoom away from the house. They couldn't understand why the car was tailing them, or if they had any malicious intentions, or maybe it was just they simply changed their minds when they noticed that the house lights were on. The girls didn't get to see a license plate or a clearer description other than a blue vehicle because they had only seen the front side of the car, so the girls were safe. But it's still an extremely scary thought to know that a car had stalked them and now knows where they live. Number 2. Haunted Highway. A man was driving through 29 Palms, California to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and decided to take a shortcut through Amboy. Amboy is almost a completely abandoned town, nearly as far below sea level as Death Valley. There's a dormant volcano and lava field on one side and a salt flat on the other. It was also, at the time, a hotspot for satanic group activity. So, perfect shortcut. Not. The guy was scared of the area and even decided to pull over and take a picture of the city sign to show his pals who had challenged him to take that route. He then hopped back into his car and drove up into the mountains between Amboy and I-40. He drove north into a canyon with thick grass on both sides of the road till he reached the top. He noticed something in the middle of the road ahead of him. As he approached, he slowed down to find a red Pontiac Fiero stopped in both lanes, a suitcase open with clothing strewn around, and 2 dead bodies of a man and a woman lying face down on the road. He brought his car to a screeching halt and reached beneath his seat to draw a 9mm handgun just in case. Something didn't feel right. Obviously, seeing dead bodies on the road is terrifying, but everything seemed a little too staged. He couldn't imagine getting out of the car. As a result, he examined the road for a spot he could drive through. He sped past the Fiero's back end without hitting it or the bodies on the road. He proceeded ahead for a few hundred feet before slowing down to allow himself to breathe and to let his heart settle down. As he peered up into the rearview mirror, he noticed that the bodies had risen to their knees and that 20 or so people had come from the long grass on each side of the road where the car and the bodies were parked. His right foot slammed the gas pedal to the floor, and he didn't let up until he was further down the road. Who knows what would have happened to him if he had gotten out of the car. Number 1. Forgotten Stop. This next story comes from a man that had been working as a homicide investigator for over 30 years. This case occurred in northern Scandinavia in an area of the nation that is largely covered in dense pine forest. There are some towns and quiet residences along the route between the cities in the area of this country, but there are parts that appear to continue on forever with just pine trees as far as the eye can see. A young woman in her early 20s was returning home in a motor coach after visiting friends and family in the south. As winter was approaching, it was quite cold outside after dark. This girl lived in one of those little towns that you pass down the highway, but she had fallen asleep on the bus and missed her stop. Looking at her watch, she realized they'd only just gone through, and that if she immediately got off, she'd be able to walk back in around 3 hours. Either this, or she'd have to get off at the next city where she knew no one and had no place to stay. She told the bus driver everything, and he drove her over to the next available parking stop and let her off. And that was the last time she was seen by anyone. 15 years after the search for her was called off, a hiker would come across her body. It was discovered tied to a tree a long way away from the road in the forest. No indications of physical violence were found during the autopsy. Someone had just dumped her alive in the middle of nowhere. What happened after she got off the bus and who tied her up to the tree remains a mystery. Thanks for watching. Have you ever hitchhiked before? What happened? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time on The Bad Badger.